Most people who have come close to death say the same thing. In that moment, they were more awake than at any other time in their lives. Hello, and welcome to Sleep by Knowledge. Death moments often remembered more vividly than childhood memories, even more clearly than the most important days of a lifetime. And why does the sense of reality in those experiences cause so many people, after returning, to say that they never see the world and death in the same way again? If you have ever feared death, not because of pain, but because you do not know what waits beyond it. If you have ever wondered what happens to consciousness when the body no longer functions. If you have ever felt that everyday life sometimes feels like living inside a thin fog, lacking depth, lacking full presence, then this video is not created to convince you to believe in anything. It is created to invite you to reconsider a very different hypothesis, a gentle yet profound way of understanding that perhaps, in everyday life, our brains are not creating the entirety of reality we experience, but are constantly filtering it, compressing it, and softening it so that we can survive. And when those filters begin to weaken, when the body no longer has to maintain its familiar life-sustaining functions, what remains is not darkness, but a layer of awareness that is less shielded, a layer that many people describe as more real than life itself. In tonight's long journey, we will move very slowly through this paradox, using neuroscience, observations from near-death experiences, and open questions that do not demand quick answers. You do not need to understand everything right now. You only need to stay, to listen, and to allow your consciousness to drift with the story, much like the night sky slowly opens when the city lights begin to fade. And if you are listening to this video at night, let it continue to play. Perhaps, as your brain gradually rests, you too will sense a small part of what we're about to explore. Right now, as you are listening to these words, your brain is doing something incredibly complex, yet very quiet. It is not showing you the world as it truly is. It is showing you an edited version, trimmed down, softened, so that you can continue to live, continue to move, continue to exist inside a finite body. If your brain allowed you to perceive the full reality every second, with all its details, all its layers of sound, light, memory, emotion, and association, you would not even be able to get out of bed, let alone live a normal day. The brain is like a massive data compression system, like taking a very large photograph and compressing it to send. Many details are removed, but the image remains clear enough for you to recognize what matters. Our everyday consciousness works the same way. It is a low-resolution copy of a reality that is far wider and deeper. We do not see the world itself. We see the version the brain allows. There's a very important principle in cognitive science that says the map is never the territory. A city map, no matter how detailed, will never contain the scent of a street after rain, or the feeling of sunlight on your skin on a quiet afternoon. A map only keeps what is necessary for navigation. The brain does the same. It is not concerned with giving you the most truthful experience possible. It is concerned with keeping you alive for as long as it can. Because of this, in everyday life, many layers of experience are softened or blurred. Time becomes linear, memories are arranged into order, emotions are labelled, and the sense of self is constructed as a control centre so you can react quickly to the world. You do not notice this, because you have lived inside this filtered version since the moment you were born. But what happens when that filtering mechanism begins to weaken? When the body enters a critical state, the brain faces a very different survival choice. It no longer has the resources to maintain all the finely tuned control systems built for long-term living. The regions responsible for planning, maintaining the ego, controlling fear, and organizing experience begin to reduce their activity. This is not a chaotic collapse, but more like a building slowly turning off its lights to conserve energy. And as those higher control layers weaken, deeper layers of experience begin to emerge, not because the brain suddenly creates something new, but because it no longer has the strength to keep shielding them. Like removing an audio filter and suddenly hearing frequencies that were always blocked before, many people who have had near-death experiences say they did not feel confused at all. On the contrary, they felt a level of clarity that is hard to believe. Colours became more vivid, emotions felt more complete, and the sense of self was no longer confined to the familiar physical form. What is striking is that they do not describe it as a dream. They describe it as a state of awareness even deeper than waking consciousness. This goes against our everyday intuition. We are taught that when the brain lacks oxygen, when biological activity weakens, consciousness must fade, but near-death experiences suggest another possibility, that perhaps consciousness is not proportional to how much control the brain exerts, but that sometimes it becomes clearer when that control is loosened. Think of the rare moments in everyday life when you completely lose track of time, perhaps while listening to a piece of music that brings tears to your eyes, or while standing before a vast natural landscape where no thoughts can intrude. In those moments, the small sense of self seems to dissolve, and the experience becomes more complete. The brain, for a moment, stops analysing, stops labelling, and allows you to remain with reality without compressing it too much. A near-death experience is like an extreme expansion of that state, but this time, it does not last for a few seconds. It happens in a context where the entire survival system is letting go. Time is no longer arranged by the brain into past, present, and future. Many people say they do not feel time passing at all. Everything seems to happen at once, but without chaos. It is like seeing an entire book open at once, instead of reading it line by line. Memory in this state is also very different from ordinary memory. In daily life, memory is stored and retrieved selectively. Each time you remember an event, you are actually recreating it, and with each recreation, it changes slightly. But near-death memories are often described as intact, not fading over time, and not distorted by current emotions. This suggests they're recorded in a very different state of consciousness, where the brain no longer strongly interferes with editing the experience. Another phenomenon often reported is the sensation of leaving the body, not in an imaginative sense, but in a perceptual one. The person no longer feels that they are inside the body, but feels like the observer of that body. From a scientific perspective, this may relate to the brain regions that integrate bodily sensations no longer working in sync. But what matters more than the mechanism is the subjective experience. It shows that the sense of self does not necessarily have to be tightly bound to physical form, and when that binding loosens, a very common feeling appears, a deep sense of peace, not happiness, not excitement, but a state where fear no longer exists, because fear is a survival function. When survival is no longer the top priority, fear has no reason to remain. The brain no longer needs to constantly warn, defend, and predict danger. Many people say that after this experience, they no longer fear death. Not because they believe in a specific heaven, but because they have experienced a state of consciousness that does not depend on the body in the way they once assumed. This completely changes how they see life. Everyday existence, with all its worries and pressures, suddenly feels like a thin surface, beneath which lies a depth they had never touched before. Seen this way, a near-death experience is not something supernatural happening outside the rules. It may be a rare moment when the brain's filters are partially turned off, allowing consciousness to engage more directly with reality. Not a different reality, but the same one, less compressed, less distorted. And this leads to a very gentle, but very deep question. If consciousness can become clearer when the brain no longer tightly controls it, how much of our current life is happening in a blurred state that we never notice? Perhaps what makes near-death experiences feel more real than life is not that they add something new, but that they remove so much that is unnecessary. And as you listen to these words now, in a quiet room, with your breathing slowly calming, your brain is also beginning to loosen its grip, not to bring you anywhere near death, but to allow you to touch a lighter, deeper state. Perhaps in those moments of letting go, you will understand, not through logic, but through feeling, why experience becomes so clear when reality is no longer filtered. To understand why experiences near death become so clear and real, we need to look more deeply at how the brain functions in ordinary life. Not through dramatic images or distant theories, but through its very real, very biological structure, shaped over millions of years of evolution. The human brain is not designed to show you absolute truth. It is designed to keep you alive. From the moment you open your eyes in the morning, the brain begins choosing. It decides what is allowed into consciousness and what must remain outside, which sounds deserve attention, which images should be ignored, which memories should surface, and which emotions need to be compressed. All of this happens silently, so fast that you never realize you are being guided. One of the most important systems responsible for this is a network deep within the brain called the reticular activating system. It does not have a clear shape like a single organ, but exists as a collection of neural pathways stretching from the brainstem to higher regions. Its core function is not thinking, but deciding what is worth waking your attention and what should be ignored to conserve energy. If this system did not exist, you would be overwhelmed instantly. The sound of a fan spinning, your own heartbeat, electricity running through the walls, the feeling of clothes against your skin, all of it would flood consciousness at once. You would not be able to focus, to act, or to survive. So this system constantly plays the role of a gatekeeper, only opening the door to signals judged to be important. But here is the key point. The criteria for importance is not truth, but usefulness. The brain does not ask, does this reflect reality fully? It asks, does this help the body survive? A strange sound in the dark is prioritized over the beauty of the night sky. A painful memory may be pushed down so you can keep functioning. An emotion that is too intense may be softened so you're not paralyzed. Truth, if it does not serve survival, can be discarded without mercy. Alongside the reticular activating system, there is another structure that acts as the brain's central relay station, the thalamus. Almost all sensory information from the outside world, except smell, passes through it before reaching consciousness. The thalamus is not just a passive relay. It constantly adjusts the intensity, rhythm, and level of detail of information sent to higher regions. You can imagine the thalamus as a light mixer. It decides which scenes should be illuminated and which should be dimmed. In normal waking life, it works very closely with the cortex, constantly exchanging signals to keep your experience stable, consistent, and suitable for controlling the body and the physical world. This stability creates the sense of a continuous self, a coherent timeline, and an orderly world. But the cost of that stability is a poverty of experiential depth. Many layers of information are blocked at the very beginning, never reaching awareness. In everyday life, you do not feel the subtle movement of time in each moment. You do not feel the complex interweaving of memory in the present. You do not feel the openness of awareness beyond the body, not because these things do not exist, but because the brain has decided they are not necessary for survival right now. And then, when the body enters a critical condition, the balance begins to shift. The brain no longer has the resources to maintain all the finely tuned control systems built for long-term living. The reticular activating system weakens. The thalamus no longer regulates information in the familiar way. The constant dialogue between brain regions is disrupted. What is important to understand is that this is not a total collapse. It is like gradually loosening your grip on the steering wheel when the road ahead no longer matters. Survival priorities that once dominated consciousness begin to step back. And in that space, signals that were previously blocked begin to appear. Many people describe that during a near-death experience, they are no longer pulled by trivial thoughts. There is no constant inner voice, no pressure to react, to judge, to control. This is very different from panic. It feels more like a deep silence, where awareness remains, but is no longer fragmented by thousands of survival decisions each minute. From a scientific perspective, when filtering systems weaken, the brain may enter an unusual state of activity. Brain regions that rarely communicate in everyday life begin to synchronize. Functional boundaries blur. Information is no longer fragmented by task, but experienced as a whole. In this state, many people report perceiving everything at once, without being overwhelmed. It sounds contradictory, but if you have ever experienced a deep meditative moment or an intense encounter with nature, you may recognize it. When survival filters temporarily step aside, consciousness does not drown, it expands. This helps explain why near-death memories have a very different quality from ordinary ones. In daily life, memories are recorded in a noisy context, full of calculations and labels. But in a state where survival filters no longer dominate, experience is recorded more directly, with less interference. It does not need to serve the next action, so it is not compressed into fragmented pieces. One striking consequence of this is a change in the sense of self. The survival-based self we are familiar with is actually a very refined structure, maintained by constant coordination between filtering systems. When those systems weaken, the self is no longer continuously updated, and when it is no longer anchored tightly to body and time, awareness can drift into a state many describe as boundless. Not a loss of consciousness, but a loss of contraction. Awareness is no longer forced into a single point of view. It no longer needs to cling to the story of who I am in order to guide action. And in that state, many people feel a profound peace. Not because all of life's problems have been solved, but because those problems were created by survival filters that no longer dominate. Seen this way, a near-death experience is not something added to consciousness, but something removed. The removal of censorship layers, the removal of survival priorities, the removal of familiar limits. And when those layers are lifted, reality is experienced more directly, with less distortion. This also raises a meaningful question for everyday life. If the brain always prioritizes usefulness over truth, how much of reality have we never touched? Not because it does not exist, but because we never needed it to survive. Perhaps the feeling that near-death experiences are more real than life is not because they take us to another world, but because they take us out of a filtering system that has operated our entire lives. And as you listen to these words now, in a gradually relaxed state, your brain is also temporarily loosening some of its familiar survival priorities, not to take you anywhere dangerous, but to allow you to feel more deeply. Perhaps simply understanding that the brain does not show you all of reality, but only what is necessary, is already a gentle step towards seeing the world, and yourself, through a different lens. There is a very common misunderstanding when we talk about death. We often picture it like a switch being flipped off. The heart stops. The brain shuts down. Consciousness disappears. But the human body does not work that way. Death is not a single moment. It is a process. And inside that process, there is a very unusual phase where biology and experience move on completely different rhythms. When the body begins to enter a critical state, the first thing that often happens is that the heartbeat slows down or becomes irregular. Blood is no longer pumped evenly through the body. Oxygen, the most important fuel for the brain, starts to drop. But what matters is this. The brain does not die the instant oxygen falls. The brain is an organ with multiple layers of activity, and those layers do not shut down all at once. In the first minutes of falling oxygen, the brain does not fall into darkness. It shifts states. Like a city during a major blackout, non-essential areas go dark first, while critical areas stay powered by backup systems. But in this case, what is prioritized is no longer complex thinking or behavioral control. What remains are the more basic, deeper functions. The brain regions responsible for maintaining the sense of self, tracking time, planning, and evaluating begin to reduce activity. These are the regions that consume a huge amount of energy in everyday life. When energy becomes scarce, the brain is forced to choose, and that choice does not always match our intuition. Instead of preserving the highest control systems, the brain begins to loosen them, not because they do not matter, but because in the ultimate survival situation, they are no longer necessary. You do not need to plan for tomorrow. You do not need to maintain an image of yourself. You do not need to compare, judge, or worry. Those functions were useful when you still had to live in the physical world, but now they become a burden. And when these control systems weaken, what happens next is not emptiness. It is a shift in center of gravity. The experiential system, the layers of awareness that do not directly serve action, begins to take over. The brain stops trying to control the world. It begins to register it. Many people who have come close to death describe that in that moment. They no longer feel pulled forward by thoughts. The familiar inner monologue is gone. The feeling of needing to do something next disappears. Instead, there is a strange state where they are still aware, still present, but no longer forced to control experience. From a biological point of view, this can be understood as a reversal of priorities. In normal life, the control system stands in front of the experiential system. The brain constantly asks, "What do I need to do with this information?" But when the body begins to shut down, that question no longer has meaning. And when the question vanishes, information is no longer distorted to serve action. This is a key point in understanding why near-death experiences are so often described as clear and real, not because the brain creates a new world, but because it stops editing the old one. The filters built for survival begin to collapse, layer by layer. As oxygen continues to fall, electrical activity in the brain does not disappear immediately. In fact, in some cases, researchers have observed unusual bursts of synchronization between brain regions. Areas that work separately in everyday life begin to connect in a different way. The boundaries between sensation, memory, and emotion start to blur. That helps explain why many people say they experience everything as a single whole. They are no longer hearing sound with ears, seeing images with eyes, or recalling memory with memory. Everything seems to merge into one continuous stream of experience, not fragmented, not interrupted. One especially striking feature is the sense of time in this state. When the control system weakens, the brain no longer maintains its familiar timekeeping rhythm. There is no clear separation between before and after. Many people describe an endless stretching of the moment, but without boredom or tension. Time does not disappear. It simply loses its dominance. In everyday life, time is a survival tool. It helps you predict, plan, and avoid danger. But when survival is no longer the goal, time is no longer needed in that way. And when time loosens, experience becomes deeper because it is no longer chopped into separate slices. Another thing often reported is a change in how the body is felt. When bodily control systems weaken, the sense of physical boundaries becomes less clear. The person does not necessarily feel pain or panic. Instead, many describe a lightness, as if the body is no longer the center of awareness. This does not mean the brain stops working. It means the brain stops prioritizing the constant updating of the body map. In daily life, the brain must always know where the hands are, where the feet are, how the heart is beating, to keep the body safe. But as the body begins to shut down, maintaining that map no longer serves a purpose. And when the map fades, consciousness is no longer anchored to the familiar physical form. That loosening creates what many people call the feeling of leaving the body. Not as something supernatural, but as a natural consequence of survival control withdrawing. Awareness is no longer confined by familiar physical coordinates, and so experience feels wider. What matters is that in most near-death reports, this state is not accompanied by fear. That can sound hard to believe, because we usually associate death with panic. But fear is a survival response. It requires energy. It requires predicting the future. It requires a self that must be protected. When those priorities fade, fear naturally weakens. Instead, many people describe a deep acceptance, not resignation, but a wordless understanding that there is nothing left that needs to be done. When there is no longer a fight to survive, awareness can shift into a purer state of observation. From the outside, we might say the brain is weakening. But from the inside of the experience, many people say they feel stronger, clearer, and more present. This is the central paradox of near-death experience. Biology weakens, but awareness does not vanish. It changes shape, and that raises a very deep question about how we understand consciousness. If consciousness were only the direct product of optimal biological activity, then as biology declines, consciousness should decline with it. But near-death experience suggests another possibility, that perhaps part of consciousness is not tightly dependent on maintaining survival control, and may even be released when that control dissolves. There is no need to rush into metaphysical conclusions. It is enough to notice one simple thing. In everyday life, we live in a state that is heavily driven by survival needs. Every thought, emotion, and decision is filtered through the question, is this safe? But when the body begins to shut down, that question no longer dominates. And when it disappears, experience is no longer distorted to serve it. Maybe that is why so many people say that near death was the moment they felt most like themselves. Not the social self, not the survival self, but a kind of presence that does not need to defend itself. A kind of awareness that does not constantly react, but simply knows. And as you listen to these words, in a quiet space, with your body gradually relaxing, you're also experiencing a very gentle version of that shift, not because your body is shutting down, but because your brain is temporarily loosening some of its control. When you no longer need to react, when you no longer need to do anything, awareness can drift into something deeper. Maybe understanding what happens as the body begins to shut down is not about preparing for death, but about realizing that even in this life, there are moments when, if we allow the control system to rest, experience can become clearer and more real. You do not have to wait for the final boundary. You only have to recognize that the survival filter does not always need to run at full power. There is one very strange detail in most near-death stories. Not the light, not the feeling of leaving the body, but the way the memory of that moment stays. Many people say they forget so much in everyday life. They forget familiar names. They forget things that happened just days ago, but they never forget their near-death experience. It does not fade over the years. It does not get mixed with imagination. It remains intact, vivid, as if it happened yesterday. That goes against how memory usually works. In normal life, memory is fragile. Each time you recall an event, you do not reopen a complete recording. You rebuild it from scattered fragments. And during that rebuilding, the memory changes. Present emotion leaks in. New information leaks in. The brain edits the past to fit the story it is currently telling about you. But near-death memory is different. Many people say they do not have to try to remember it. The memory simply appears, whole, with full color, emotion, and depth. They remember not only what happened, but the feeling of being present in that moment. They remember it so clearly that they say, compared to it, most everyday memories feel like old photographs that have lost their color. The feeling of more real than real that so many mention is not just exaggeration. It reflects a very different state of perception. In ordinary life, your experience passes through multiple layers of processing before it is stored. The brain constantly asks whether the experience matters, whether it relates to survival, whether it needs detailed storage. Most of the time, the answer is no, and so the experience is compressed, softened, before it becomes memory. But in the near-death state, that mechanism changes. When survival control weakens, the brain no longer has to decide which experiences will be useful for the future. It no longer has to optimize memory for the next action. Instead, experience is recorded as it is, without being compressed, without being edited. This may explain why color in near-death memories is often described as unusually intense, not because the light is literally stronger, but because the brain is no longer turning down sensory information. In everyday life, you rarely see the full richness of the world's color. The brain dims it so you're not overloaded. But when that filter weakens, color returns with its natural fullness. Emotions in near-death memory also feel very different. Not separate emotions like happiness, sadness, or fear, but something whole, deep, hard to name. Many people describe it as being surrounded by peace, or a kind of love that is not aimed at any specific person. What matters here is not the content of the emotion, but its depth. It is not diluted by small thoughts or familiar worries. That depth gives near-death memory a structure that differs from ordinary memory. In daily life, memory is pinned to a timeline. You remember this happened first, that happened later. But in near-death memory, many people say everything seems to happen at once. Not chaotic, but simultaneous. This creates the sense of an open experience, where you do not just remember a sequence of events, you remember an entire state of being. This difference can be felt more clearly if you compare an ordinary dream to a lucid dream. In a normal dream, you're swept along by the story. When you wake up, the dream memory quickly dissolves. Details blur, very little emotion remains. But in a lucid dream, when you realize you're dreaming, everything changes. Colors become sharper, presence becomes stronger, and memory of that dream often stays longer. A lucid dream does not feel stronger because the brain is working harder, but because awareness shifts position. You are no longer passively carried by the story. You are present inside the experience. A near-death experience has similarities to that state, but at a far deeper level. It is not just realizing, it is completely letting go of the role of control. In that state, the brain no longer has to build a story for you to follow. It no longer has to label, categorize, or arrange experience according to familiar logic. That allows experience to be recorded directly, without so many layers in between. And memory formed under those conditions has a very different quality. Another important factor is the absence of inner conflict. In everyday life, your experience is always divided by parallel thoughts. One part of you is living the moment, Another part is worrying about the future or regretting the past. This fragmentation weakens the depth of experience and makes memory thinner. In near-death experience, many people say that division is gone. There are not multiple voices at once. No inner arguing. Experience is lived fully, without interruption, and that wholeness is what makes memory deep and lasting. This also helps explain why near-death memory is often not doubted by the person who had it. With a dream, it is easy to say, maybe I imagined it. But with near-death experience, many people insist they know it was not imagination. Not because they believe in a theory, but because the quality of experience is completely different. It has a solidity, a clarity, that imagination rarely produces. From a scientific view, when the brain is no longer prioritizing survival, it no longer needs to continuously generate predictive models. That prediction stream in everyday life is one of the main things that blurs experience. The brain does not show you what is happening. It shows you what it predicts is happening. But when prediction is no longer needed, experience becomes more direct. And it is that directness that makes near-death memory feel like an uncompressed recording. While everyday memory feels like a file that has been reduced in size, near-death memory holds far more data. Not data about events, but data about presence itself. What is worth reflecting on is that many people after this experience say they begin to look back at their life memories differently. They realize that much of life passed in a state that felt dreamlike, not because they were not awake, but because they were constantly pulled away by thoughts, worries, and plans. Compared to the near-death moment, everyday life seems to lack depth. That does not mean near-death experience is an ideal state you should try to reach. It simply shows a possibility. That memory, and experience in general, does not depend only on whether the brain is strong or weak, but on how the brain filters reality. When the survival filter steps back, memory can become clearer, not because it gains something new, but because it loses so much that is unnecessary. And as you listen to these words now, in a quiet space, with your breathing becoming steady, you're also experiencing something small but real. When you no longer have to do anything, when you no longer have to react, your brain also temporarily stops compressing experience. Maybe if you simply stay with this moment, you will notice that vividness is not about intensity, it is about presence. Perhaps near-death memory is unusually vivid not because it happens at the final boundary, but because it is a rare moment when experience is lived and recorded without being blurred, and that opens a very gentle, but very deep question. If memory can become that clear when the survival filter weakens, then in this life, how much more clearly could we live? And remember, if we sometimes allowed those filters to rest. There is a phenomenon that appears in many near-death experiences, across different people, different cultures, and different beliefs, yet it carries a surprisingly consistent structure. It is the moment when an entire life seems to appear all at once, not as scattered fragments of memory, but as a whole stream of living, unfolding within a field of awareness far wider than ordinary recall. People often call this a life review, or a life flashing before your eyes, but that phrase still does not fully capture what actually seems to happen. In ordinary life, your memories are forced to stand in line. The brain runs memory like a film reel, showing frames in sequence. First, then next, cause, then effect. That ordering is necessary because it helps you learn, predict, and adjust behavior. But the cost of that order is fragmentation. You never see your entire life all at once. You only see small segments, called up when needed. When the body begins to shut down, that order is no longer necessary. The brain no longer needs memory to serve future action. There are no plans to prepare, no dangers to avoid. And when the survival purpose of memory disappears, the way the brain organizes memory shifts with it. Many people say they do not see events racing by like a fast-forwarded movie in the literal sense. They sense their entire life as an open space. Important moments, choices, emotions, and relationships do not appear in chronological order, but in layers of meaning. A small moment filled with emotion can shine more brightly than an entire year that passed in distraction. What is striking is that in this phenomenon, the brain does not remember in the usual way. It does not retrieve one memory and then piece it together with another. Instead, memory seems to be experienced as a unified field of information. the person is not watching their life from the outside like an audience member. They are inside it, but not trapped in each detail. They know, all at once, many truths about their own life. From a neuroscience perspective, this suggests that when control systems weaken, the brain no longer maintains the familiar mechanism of lining up memories. In everyday life, the networks involved in memory have to operate in a very tight rhythm. One memory is activated, then switched off to make room for the next. This prevents overload. But when energy becomes scarce and survival goals no longer dominate, the brain has less reason to maintain this strict order. As a result, the boundaries between memories blur. Instead of separate pieces, the person senses one continuous stream of living, not a chain of events, but a whole feeling of how life was lived. That explains why many people say they not only see what happened, but understand themselves more deeply within those moments. One important point is that this life review is not judgmental in the way many imagine. It is not a moral courtroom. Many people say they were not judged, and they did not judge themselves in the familiar way. Instead, there is a clear awareness. They see the impact of their actions, words, and choices, not through the lens of right and wrong, but through the lens of experience. That suggests a deep shift in how the brain relates to memory. In everyday life, memory is tied to ego. You remember to protect your image. You forget to avoid pain. You edit so your personal story stays consistent. But when the survival ego weakens, memory no longer has to protect the self. It can appear as it is. Some people even say that in that moment, they not only saw what they did, but felt what others felt in those situations, not as a logical guess, but as direct empathy. From a scientific angle, this could relate to networks for emotion and social understanding no longer being strongly separated. When functional boundaries blur, experience becomes more complete. That completeness makes the life review intensely vivid. It does not feel like recalling an old memory. It feels like reliving an entire life within a wider state of awareness. And that is why the experience is remembered so deeply, so persistently, and so hard to dismiss. What is worth reflecting on is that many people after this phenomenon say they realize that much of life was lived without true presence, not because they were not awake, but because they were constantly pulled away by goals, worries, and reactions. When life appears in a near-death moment, they see it for the first time as a whole, not broken into pieces by everyday busyness. From the perspective of one killer point, the life review is not a special function activated to comfort people as they die. It is the natural result of the survival filter shutting down. When the brain no longer has to use memory to control behavior, memory no longer needs to be organized in a survival-friendly order. And when that order dissolves, experience does not blur, it becomes clearer. This also explains why the phenomenon does not follow linear time. Time, in everyday life, is a survival tool. It helps you predict, prepare, and learn. But when there is no longer an action to take, time no longer serves as the organizing axis of experience. Memory no longer has to stand in line. It can appear all at once, like points in a space rather than points on a line. When time loses its organizing role, experience becomes deeper, because it is no longer forced into a one-way flow. The person is not swept along, but stands within a field of awareness where everything is present, and that creates the feeling that the moment contains more than an entire life stretched across decades. One detail that matters is that people do not usually feel overwhelmed. Instead, many say they feel lighter, as if for the first time they are not carrying the weight of past and future. That suggests that overload in everyday life does not come from the amount of experience, but from the brain's constant need to process experience for survival. When the brain no longer has to do that, experience can expand without strain. It is a beautiful paradox. Less control, but more clarity. Less purpose, but more meaning. The life review before death, then, does not only speak about death, it speaks about how we live. That most of the time, we are not living in direct experience, but in a version that has been organized, compressed, and softened to make survival easier. And as you listen to these words now, in a relaxed state, your brain is also temporarily stopping its habit of lining memories up. You do not need to return to the past. You do not need to prepare for the future. You only need to be here, in this moment, And maybe, in that gentle staying, you will sense a small echo of what near-death experiences describe, not the life flashing past, but the opening of experience when the survival filter rests. Perhaps understanding this phenomenon is not about waiting for the final moment, but about realizing that even in life right now, if we allow ourselves to live with less control, less compression, then experience can become far clearer and far more real. In so many near-death stories, there is a moment that people describe with the same feeling, even if they use different words. It is the moment they realize they are no longer in the body, not in an imaginary or vague sense, but in a very clear perceptual sense. They are no longer seeing the world from behind the familiar eyes. They can see their own body from somewhere else. What makes this experience so striking is not what they see, but how it feels to see it. Not panic, not shock, but a strange calm, as if not being in the body is completely natural. Many people say they saw themselves lying there, unmoving, yet they felt no fear and no regret. They simply watched, clearly, lucidly. In everyday life, your awareness is anchored to a single point of view. You see the world from where your eyes are. You feel space from the center of your body. Your brain constantly updates a body map so you know where you are, how much space you occupy, and whether you are safe. That map matters so much that you almost never notice it exists. You simply assume you are this body, but that map is not you. It is a model, a cognitive structure the brain builds to operate a body in the physical world. And like any model, it takes energy to maintain. When energy becomes scarce, when survival priorities begin to dissolve, that map is no longer updated non-stop. When that happens, awareness does not vanish. It just stops being pinned to the familiar physical coordinates. And that loosening is what creates the out-of-body experience. Many people say they feel as if they are above, looking down, not because they flew upward, but because perspective is no longer locked to the body. From a neuroscience point of view, this could involve disruptions in the brain regions that integrate vision, touch, and the sense of position. But if we stop at mechanism alone, we miss the most important part, the person's inner experience. What is remarkable is that in that moment, awareness does not become dim or confused. In fact, many people say they feel more awake than ever. They notice space, sound, and details they would normally ignore. Not because the brain is processing faster, but because it no longer has to keep tying experience to action. In everyday life, you do not just look. You look in order to do something. You do not just hear. You hear in order to respond. Experience is constantly pulled toward the next action. But in an out-of-body state, that chain is cut. There is no action to prepare, no reaction required. And when experience is no longer dragged toward the future, it can be fully lived in the present. Many people say they observe their body as if it is a familiar object, but no longer the center of who they are. They know it is their body, but they do not feel that they are it. That distinction is subtle, but it matters. It shows that the feeling of I am this body is not automatic truth. It is the result of the brain continuously maintaining the body map. When that map weakens, awareness is no longer forced to identify with physical form. And in that non-identification, many people feel a deep relief. No heaviness of the body. No constant signals of pain, tension, or fatigue. Not because the body stops existing, but because awareness no longer has to carry it as the center of experience. One important point is that this out-of-body experience is not paired with the sense of losing control. In everyday life, losing control often triggers fear, but in this state, there is no feeling that control is necessary. Awareness no longer needs to manage, it only needs to know, and when it no longer has to control, experience becomes lighter and clearer. This also helps explain why some people in this state report noticing very precise details about what is happening around their body, not because they have some supernatural ability, but because experience is no longer narrowed by survival demands. In everyday life, you mainly attend to what relates directly to you. Everything else is filtered out. But when the body map is no longer the center, the boundary between me and the surroundings starts to blur. And when that boundary blurs, perception can expand. The person does not just know themselves, but also knows the space they are in. Not through thought, but through a more direct kind of awareness. That creates the feeling that the world becomes wider, deeper, and less divided. From the perspective of one killer point, the out-of-body experience is not proof that consciousness leaves the brain in a physical way. It is proof that consciousness is not completely dependent on maintaining the body map. When that map dissolves, experience does not disappear. It changes its structure, and that raises a powerful question. If the sense of self can shift so deeply when survival control weakens, then how fragile is the self we cling to in everyday life? Maybe a great deal of our stress, fear, and suffering comes from over-identifying with the body map and the story built around it. Some people after this experience say they no longer fear physical pain in the same way, not because they feel nothing, but because they have learned that pain does not define their entire experience. Awareness can exist within a wider structure, one that feels less confined. This does not mean the out-of-body state is something you should chase or try to achieve. It simply reveals something simple and profound. Awareness is not locked into a single point of view. And when the survival filter steps back, awareness can experience the world in ways we rarely touch in ordinary life. If you have ever had a moment when you felt as if you were observing yourself from the outside, even for a second, maybe when you were exhausted, or deeply relaxed, or very still, then you have touched this lightly. Not a near-death experience, but a small opening in the familiar structure of the ego. In those moments, you do not disappear. You simply stop being forced to be something. And it is that lack of pressure that creates the feeling of relief, clarity, and realness. When someone near death sees their body from the outside, they are not seeing with eyes. They are perceiving with a kind of awareness that does not require a center. And maybe that is why this experience is described as more real than everyday life. Not because it adds something new, but because it removes a major limit. That limit is total identification with physical form. When that limit loosens, even for a moment, experience can open in very different ways. There is no need to explain it with metaphysical ideas. It is enough to understand that in everyday life, the brain does a great deal of work to keep you tightly attached to the body. And when that work stops, experience does not collapse. It changes. And as you listen to these words now, with your body lying still and your breathing slowing down, your brain is also temporarily reducing how often it updates the body map. You do not need to know exactly where your hands are, or where your feet are, in order to simply listen. In that gentle loosening, you may sense a bit of space opening around awareness. Not to leave the body, but to realize you are not only the body. Perhaps understanding the out-of-body experience is not about preparing for death, but about realizing that even in this life, when we identify less with our form and our story, experience can become lighter, deeper, and far more real. And that is what near-death experiences touch, not through effort, but through the survival filter letting go. After the moment when awareness is no longer anchored to the body, many people near death describe something that confuses them most when they return. It is not the light, not the imagery. It is a feeling of love so deep they have never known it in everyday life. Not love in a personal sense, not love for one person or one specific memory, but an all-encompassing state, unconditional, effortless, with no reason required. What is striking is that this feeling does not come from positive thinking or a comforting memory. It is not the brain trying to soothe itself. Instead, it appears when the brain no longer has to do what it has been doing for an entire lifetime. Defend. In everyday life, your brain runs on a subtle background of fear, not always obvious fear, but a constant state of vigilance. You track who might be judging you, what could harm you, what could cause you to lose status, lose safety, or lose control. Even when you feel relaxed, part of your brain is still scanning the environment, like a security system always running at a low setting. At the center of this system are structures that process fear and threat. They operate faster and more powerfully than you might expect. They decide what deserves attention, what should be avoided, and what should be pushed out of awareness. That is how you survive. But the cost is that your experience is always covered by a thin layer of background tension. When the body enters a near-death state, survival priorities begin to collapse. Not because the brain chooses to let go, but because it no longer has the resources to maintain that complex defensive system. As energy falls, the brain regions responsible for fear responses and vigilance do not function the way they normally do. And when fear is no longer the command center of experience, a very different state begins to show itself. Many people say they feel absolutely safe, not safe because someone is protecting them, but safe because the need to be protected is gone. There is no threat left to evaluate, no future left to worry about, no ego left that must keep its image intact. In that state, love is not a bursting emotion. It is a quiet ground. It does not come and go. It is simply there, as if it has always existed, but was previously hidden behind the noise of defense and control. When that noise fades, what remains is not emptiness, but a gentle widening. This is important for understanding one killer point correctly. The love and peace in near-death experience are not created by dying. They are revealed when survival mechanisms no longer cover awareness, like a lake that is always calm underneath, but only when the wind stops do you finally see a clear reflection. Many people describe feeling completely accepted, not judged, not compared, not required to become someone else. This is the opposite of everyday life, where the ego must constantly prove its worth. In a near-death state, the survival ego no longer has to work, and when the ego is no longer working, love does not need an object. One especially notable detail is that in this state, many people say they feel a deep connection with everything, not as a philosophical idea, but as direct feeling. The boundary between me and not me becomes thin, and when that boundary thins, love is no longer something you do outward. It becomes a way of being. From a scientific angle, this could relate to weakening in the brain networks that maintain separation between self and world. But from the inside of experience, what matters more is the sense that there is nothing left to lose. And when there is nothing left to lose, fear has nowhere to stand. In everyday life, much of our behavior is driven by fear of loss. Losing safety, losing love, losing meaning, losing self. But in near-death experience, when the body is no longer prioritized for preservation, fear of loss becomes meaningless. And when fear dissolves, what remains is not chaos, but peace. Many people after this say they no longer fear death the way they once did. Not because they are certain what happens afterward, but because they have touched a state not governed by fear. They know that, at least in that moment, awareness could exist without defense. That does not mean you can or should turn off your fear system in everyday life. You need it to live and interact in the world. But near-death experience suggests that fear is not the default state of consciousness. It is a functional layer activated for survival. And beneath that layer, there may be another ground, wider and gentler. When near-death experiences describe overwhelming love, they do not feel like they are loving someone. They feel like they are inside love, like the air you breathe. It does not need to be created, only not blocked. And that feeling is what causes so many people to return and live differently. Less defensive, less reactive, less tightly attached. Not because they learned a moral lesson, but because they directly experienced a state that does not require the survival ego. And direct experience has more power to change a life than any belief. If we look deeper, this also raises a very gentle but very deep question. If, when defense is no longer needed, awareness naturally settles into peace and love, then how much of our daily suffering comes from always needing to stay safe, correct, and good enough? And are there small moments in life, when you loosen control, where that state quietly appears? As you lie here listening, as the body relaxes and breathing slows, your brain's defensive system also temporarily turns down. You do not need to judge. You do not need to react. You do not need to prepare. In that moment, you might feel a small touch of peace. Not because something wonderful happens, but because there is nothing you need to fight. Maybe what near-death experience is whispering is not a message about another world, but a truth that is very close. That love and peace are not a final reward. They may be the natural state of awareness when it is no longer forced to survive. And understanding that, even while still living, may already soften many fears in the heart. When people listen to descriptions of near-death experience, it can feel like something completely separate, something that only happens at the boundary between life and death. But when scientists and long-time meditation practitioners began placing these stories alongside other altered states of consciousness, a more subtle picture began to appear. Not to claim these experiences are identical, but to notice a shared pattern that is deep, quiet, and remarkably consistent. In deep meditation, especially in states where the meditator is no longer focusing on the breath or any specific object, many people describe the sense of self gradually dissolving. Not a loss of consciousness, but a loss of the feeling that I am the one in control. Thoughts grow sparse. The story of me, of past and future, becomes faint. But what is striking is that when those things fade, awareness does not vanish. It becomes wider, calmer, and carries a brightness that is difficult to put into words. In studies of deep meditation, researchers have observed that activity in brain networks responsible for maintaining the ego story can drop significantly. These networks are typically most active when you think about yourself, evaluate yourself, worry about the future, or revisit the past. When this network quiets down, awareness is no longer pulled toward a fixed center. And when there is no fixed center, experience tends to expand. Something similar has also been reported in research on psychedelic experiences. When used under strict scientific conditions, participants often say the boundary between themselves and the world becomes thin. The sense of a separate personal self dissolves, but what replaces it is not chaos. Many people report feeling deeply connected, filled with meaning, and especially real in a way that differs from everyday life. The common thread between deep meditation and psychedelic experience is not a specific image or emotion, but the weakening of the ego control system. When that system is no longer constantly interfering, awareness is no longer filtered through the familiar survival lens. It no longer has to keep asking, how does this benefit me, or how should I react? And when those questions go quiet, experience can be lived more directly. This brings us back to near-death experience, but in a new light. In a near-death state, the weakening of ego networks does not come from practice or from an external substance. It comes from the body no longer being able to maintain that complex control system. But the subjective result can share some striking similarities. Expansion, the dissolving of the personal self, a strong presence of meaning, peace, and connection. The point is not to say these states are the same. They are not. Each has its own physiological and psychological context. But when we look at their structure, one thing becomes clear. When the ego filter weakens, awareness does not collapse. It changes its shape. In everyday life, the survival ego acts like a strict filter. It decides what is allowed into awareness and what is pushed out. It prioritizes information related to safety, identity, and control. That helps you live, work, and function in a complex world. But the cost is a narrowing of experience. In deep meditation, when you sit long enough without reacting, without chasing thoughts, the ego has less and less to do. It no longer has to defend. It no longer has to plan. And when it steps back, experience can open in very different ways. No need to create anything new, only a reduction of interference. In carefully described psychedelic experiences, participants often say they do not feel like something new is being added. They feel as if a veil is being lifted. Emotions, memories, and awareness that were always there, but compressed, rise with unusual clarity. That is very close to how near-death experiences describe what happened to them. Not traveling to another world, but seeing the familiar world with a different depth. From the perspective of one killer point, this suggests that everyday consciousness is not the full capacity of consciousness. It is a version optimized for survival. And when survival conditions change, or when the survival system temporarily steps aside, awareness can operate in a different structure, less restricted. A very concrete example is time. In deep meditation, many people say time no longer flows in the familiar way, not because they lose consciousness of time, but because experience is no longer divided into before and after. Something similar happens in psychedelic experience, where time can stretch, shrink, or become irrelevant. And in near-death experience, many people say linear time disappears. Everything feels present at once, whole. The shared pattern is the weakening of brain systems that organize experience into sequences for action. When there is no longer a need to prepare for the next step, experience no longer has to stand in line. It can appear as a whole. This also helps explain why these experiences are often remembered so clearly. Not because the brain is remembering better, but because experience is not fragmented. In everyday life, memory is constantly chopped up by worry, reaction, and distraction. But in states where the survival ego steps back, experience can be fully lived and therefore deeply remembered. One subtle point is that even if near-death experience, deep meditation, and psychedelics can produce expansion, they do not automatically create wisdom or understanding. What they offer is a different vantage point. A vantage point where you're no longer at the center trying to control, but become part of what is happening. And that shift in position is what makes experience feel more real. In deep meditation, the meditator is not trying to achieve a special state. They are simply stopping interference. In near-death experience, the person is not trying either. The body lets go first. And in psychedelic research settings, participants are often guided not to fight the experience, but to let it unfold. The common thread is letting go of control. When control steps back, the survival ego is no longer the center of awareness. And when the ego is no longer the center, experience is no longer tightened around a personal story. It can open into depths that rarely appear in everyday life. This does not mean those states are better or should be pursued. They simply reveal something important. Awareness is not identical to the survival ego. And when the ego weakens, whether through meditation, physiology, or other special conditions, awareness can show very different qualities. Wider, deeper, and less ruled by fear. When near-death experiencers say their experience felt more real than life, maybe this is what they're touching. A state where experience is no longer filtered through fear, control, and the story of me. A state that deep meditation and certain other experiences can also touch, through very different paths. And as you listen to these words now, in the quiet space of your own room, you do not need to reach any special state. Just notice that even now, as you soften and loosen control, experience already shifts a little. Awareness is less pulled toward action and has more space to simply know. Maybe the most profound thing this comparison offers is not a conclusion about death or consciousness, but a gentle reminder that for much of a life, we live inside a compressed version of experience. And when those filters soften, even for a moment, the world can become wider, brighter, and far more real. And that moment, wherever it comes from, whispers the same thing. That awareness is not only a survival tool, it is also an open space, waiting to be recognized. At this point in the journey, we touch a paradox that forces both science and ordinary intuition to slow down. In almost every other area, when a physical system weakens, its function declines. A damaged radio produces static. A cracked screen displays distortion. A weakened processor becomes slower and less accurate. But in near-death experience, what happens seems to move in the opposite direction. When the brain is deprived of oxygen, when coordinating regions reduce activity, many people do not feel their awareness dim. Instead, they say it becomes sharper, deeper, and brighter. This is not a side detail. This is the core paradox. If the brain creates consciousness in a direct sense, then as the brain weakens, consciousness should fade, like a light being unplugged. But what people report does not fit that model. And it is exactly this mismatch that forces us to revisit a question that neuroscience has treated as obvious for decades. In the common view, the brain is seen as the source of consciousness. Every thought, emotion, and experience is assumed to be the product of neurons interacting with one another. From that perspective, when those interactions are disrupted, consciousness should not be able to continue in any full way. But near-death experience, along with certain other unusual states of awareness, suggests the relationship between brain and consciousness may not be that simple. Try picturing a radio receiver. When it works normally, it filters out enormous amounts of signal, selecting only a narrow band so the sound comes through clearly. If the filter changes, the sound can become completely different, not because the outside signal changed, but because reception and processing changed. In that case, a malfunction does not necessarily make the signal vanish. Sometimes it simply reveals what used to be hidden. Some researchers and philosophers of mind have proposed a similar way of viewing the brain. In this view, the brain is not a machine that creates consciousness out of nothing. It is a biological structure that receives, shapes, and limits consciousness in order to support survival. It functions like a valve, like a pressure regulator, narrowing experience so a body can act effectively in the physical world. In everyday life, this regulator works extremely well. It helps you focus on what matters and ignore vast amounts of information that would otherwise overwhelm you. That is how you can drive, talk, work, and live without collapsing under too much input. But this same mechanism also makes experience poorer than the full possible range of consciousness. When the body enters a near-death state, that regulator begins to lose control, not because it chooses to let go, but because it no longer has the energy to keep compressing experience. And when that compression weakens, experience is no longer squeezed down. It can spill outward, wider, deeper, and less directed by survival needs. That helps explain why many people describe their awareness during near-death as intensely clear, not because the brain is processing faster, but because it is no longer constantly filtering things out. Details, emotions, and meaning that are usually blurred in everyday life can appear with unusual sharpness. One important point is that in many recorded near-death cases, measured brain electrical activity is very low or chaotic. Under a strict brain equals consciousness model, that should be the condition for thin experience, or no experience at all. Yet subjective reports often suggest the opposite. That does not prove consciousness exists independently of the brain in an absolute sense, but it raises a serious question about what role the brain is actually playing in this relationship. Maybe the brain is not the flame, but the lampshade. When a lampshade bends or cracks, the light does not necessarily go out. Sometimes it simply shines in a different way. And it is that difference that can make experience feel new and profound. In deep meditation and other unusual states of awareness, something similar can happen, though in a gentler form. When ego-related brain networks quiet down, meditators do not usually say they become less awake. They often say clarity increases, but it is no longer tied to non-stop thought. It is a kind of knowing that does not require so much structure or so much control. This suggests that the complexity of brain activity is not always proportional to the depth of experience. Sometimes simplification creates space for awareness, and in the near-death context, that simplification can happen suddenly and powerfully. A common objection is that all of this is simply hallucination caused by a brain deprived of oxygen. But even if we call it hallucination, we still face a question. Why would hallucinations in a weakened state have more structure, meaning, and clarity than hallucinations in many other states? And why would they show striking similarities across people who do not know one another, from different cultures? Ordinary hallucinations are often fragmented, hard to remember, and they fade quickly. Near-death experience, by contrast, is often remembered for a lifetime, with the sense that it is more foundational than most other memories. That suggests it may not be a random byproduct of a system breaking down, but the temporary appearance of a different structure of experience. If the brain truly functions like a receiver or a filter, that also helps explain why, when the filter weakens, consciousness does not disappear but changes in quality. It is no longer forced to serve survival. It no longer has to maintain the story of the self, and when those pressures fall away, experience may return to a wider underlying field. This does not deny the role of the brain. It actually highlights how subtle the brain's role may be in shaping experience. The brain is not the enemy of consciousness. It is an extraordinarily effective tool for narrowing consciousness into a form that can live in the physical world. But when that tool stops working, what remains is not necessarily nothing. This paradox forces us to be more humble in how we speak about consciousness. Maybe what we call ordinary consciousness is only a very thin slice of a much wider range, and the brain, rather than generating that entire range, may only allow a small portion to pass through. When near-death experiencers say their experience felt more real than life, maybe they are not saying they went somewhere else. Maybe they are saying they temporarily stepped outside the filter that makes experience thinner. In that moment, awareness was no longer compressed to serve action. It was free to exist as it is. This also carries a deep implication for everyday life. If the normal brain is constantly lowering the resolution of experience so you can survive, then much of our suffering, anxiety, and fear may not be the essence of consciousness at all. They may be side effects of survival machinery. And if, when that filter softens even slightly, experience becomes wider and more peaceful, That suggests the underlying ground of awareness may be very different from what we usually live with. As you listen to these words now, with your body gradually relaxing, with attention no longer serving any action, your brain's survival filter is also easing. You do not need to do anything to become more aware. You only need less pressure. And in that lessening, you may feel a small space open, gentle and quiet. Maybe the greatest paradox of near-death experience is not the question of whether there is life after death. It is this, that in the brain's weakening, we sometimes see another possibility of consciousness flash through, a possibility not bound by survival, not confined by ego, and therefore felt as far more real. And if the brain is truly a receiver, a regulator, then the next question is no longer whether consciousness exists. The question becomes whether we have been living inside a scaled-down version of ourselves, a version necessary for survival, but not the whole story. There is a detail that appears again and again in thousands of near-death accounts, yet it is often overlooked because it is so hard to grasp. It is the disappearance of time, not the feeling that time is moving faster or slower, but the feeling that time does not exist at all. No past, no future, no next moment to wait for. Only a deep, complete presence, still in a way that feels intensely alive. Many people say they cannot describe this experience in ordinary language, because language itself depends on time sequence. The moment you say before, after, then, or will, you are assuming time is flowing. But in that moment, there is no flow to hold on to. Experience does not unfold in a chain. It does not happen. It simply is. This matters for understanding why near-death experience is often described as more real than everyday life. Because in everyday life, you are rarely fully in the present. Most of the time, awareness swings between memory and prediction. You replay what just happened, or you prepare for what is about to come. Even when you are here, part of the brain is still building a timeline so you can take the next step. But when the body enters a near-death state, the system that maintains that timeline begins to dissolve. The brain no longer has the resources to constantly compare the present with the past and project the future. Not because it stops functioning entirely, but because the most complex, most energy-demanding functions are the first to be released. In subjective experience, time is not an independent thing. It is a product of the brain functioning normally. The brain needs time to arrange events, learn from experience, and predict danger and opportunity. Thanks to time, you can avoid repeating mistakes and prepare for tomorrow. But for that same reason, time can also become a constant weight pressing on awareness. When time is no longer maintained, awareness is no longer pulled forward or backward. It is no longer fragmented into small moments lined up in sequence. And when it is no longer fragmented, experience becomes whole in a very different way. Many near-death experiencers say they do not feel like they are existing inside a moment. They feel like they are inside everything. Not everything that happens, but everything that is present. A kind of presence with no edge, no beginning, no end. That may sound abstract, but the inner feeling is often described as very concrete, very clear, very calm. In everyday life, even the happiest moments often carry a fear of losing them. You feel joy, but you know it will pass. You feel peace, but you worry it will be interrupted. It is the awareness of time that makes every experience feel fragile. But when time is no longer the frame of reference, experience is no longer threatened by an ending. This is a key point. Many human fears do not come from physical pain. They come from the awareness of time, fear of loss, fear of aging, fear of endings, fear of not having enough time. When time disappears from experience, those fears have nowhere to stand. Not because they are solved, but because the foundation they require is gone. In a near-death state, many people say they do not feel like they are dying, because dying is a concept that belongs to time. Dying is something that happens after living. But when there is no before and after, the concept loses meaning. Instead, they simply feel present, without needing interpretation. This also helps explain why near-death experience is so often paired with deep peace. Not because something wonderful is happening, but because there is no timeline generating tension, nothing to hurry toward, nothing to avoid, no future to worry about, and no past to regret. From a scientific angle, When brain networks responsible for tracking time and planning weaken, subjective experience can become nonlinear, but from the inside, this is not felt as a deficit. It is felt as release. Some people compare it to the moment you become so absorbed in music that you forget how long the song has been playing. But in near-death experience, it is more than forgetting time. Time seems to vanish as a concept. No length, no end point. This connects closely with what can happen in deep meditation. When a meditator enters a state where they are no longer following thoughts, the sense of time can begin to fade. They do not know how long they have been sitting, but unlike sleep, awareness remains clear. In psychedelic experience, many people also say time becomes meaningless, but in near-death experience, the dissolution of time is often more complete, because it is not interrupted by the need to return to ordinary life. When time disappears, the ego also loses its footing. The ego is built from memory and projection. It needs the past to define who it is, and it needs the future to know where it is going. When both axes collapse, the personal self cannot hold its familiar shape, and when the ego dissolves, awareness does not vanish. It simply no longer wears the old form. In that state, many people say they no longer feel like a separate individual, not because they melt into something mystical, but because there is no time left to maintain boundaries. Boundaries require repetition, memory, prediction. When those are gone, boundaries become unnecessary. One thing worth reflecting on is that when time disappears, experience does not become meaningless. Many people say meaning feels deeper than ever, not meaning explained with words, but meaning felt directly, a sense that everything is in its place, with no need to change it. This challenges many assumptions we hold about consciousness. We often assume consciousness needs time in order to exist. Near-death experience suggests that awareness may exist without linear time, and if that is true, then many limits we place on consciousness may simply be limits of a brain operating under survival conditions. As you listen to these words, you may still feel time moving, but if you pay close attention, you might notice that in moments when you truly listen, without thinking, without waiting, time seems to slow, not because the clock changes, but because your awareness is no longer gripping the flow. In that moment, you do not need to be anywhere else. You do not need to become anyone else. And even if it is gentle and brief, you may touch something close to what near-death experiences describe, a kind of presence that does not need time in order to matter. Maybe the deepest thing near-death experience reveals about time is not a cosmic secret, but a truth that is very near, that in subjective experience, time is a survival tool of the brain. And when that tool stops operating, awareness does not fall into nothingness. It returns to a purer kind of presence. And if that is true, then the bigger question is no longer what happens after death. The question becomes whether, in this life, while time is still running, we can learn to touch presence more often, not by escaping time, but by realizing that even while time moves, awareness can be still. In that stillness, there may be a quiet peace, not because everything is finished, but because nothing needs to be rushed. And that feeling, gentle and deep, is what near-death experiences touch when time is no longer standing between them and experience. After returning from a near-death experience, many people say the biggest change in them is not belief, but fear. More specifically, the near disappearance of the fear of death. What is striking is that when you ask deeper, most of them do not say they saw heaven or met a supernatural being that reassured them. Instead, many emphasize that it was the experience of awareness itself that removed the fear. In everyday life, the fear of death rarely comes from the moment of dying. It comes from the idea that when the body stops functioning, everything ends, that awareness will shut off, that no one will be there to know they ever existed. This fear is not loud, but it is deep. It sits beneath many other worries: fear of losing control, fear of meaninglessness, fear of vanishing. But in near-death experience, many people say what shocked them most was not leaving the body. It was that they were still aware, not faint awareness, but clear awareness, awake, alive. While the body was no longer responding as before, consciousness did not collapse in the way they once imagined. That direct experience collapses a foundational assumption. the assumption that the body is an absolute requirement for awareness to exist. When that assumption dissolves, the fear of death loses the ground it needs. It is important to emphasize that this change does not come from adopting a new story. It comes from experiencing the opposite of the old story. Before, they might have believed death is the end. After, they can no longer believe that, not because anyone convinced them, but because their own experience revealed another possibility. Many people describe that in the near-death moment, they did not feel like they were moving toward an ending. They felt like they were leaving a familiar form, and what removed fear was that they did not feel themselves disappearing. They felt less limited than before. In everyday life, you tie your sense of self tightly to the body. You hurt when the body hurts. You feel tired when the body is tired. You feel fear when the body is threatened. This identification is so strong you rarely question it. But in near-death experience, when that identification breaks, awareness does not disappear with the body. And when that is directly experienced, fear of losing the body no longer equals fear of losing the self. One person who survived a near-death event said what brought peace was not seeing something beautiful, but realizing, I am still here, even when my body is no longer the center. That sentence sounds simple, but it carries a deep shift in perception. It is not a philosophical idea. It is lived experience. After that, many people return to life with a different attitude. They still care for the body. They still avoid danger. But beneath those actions, the primal fear has softened, not because they dismiss death, but because they no longer see death as the absolute destruction of awareness. This also helps explain why many people live more fully afterward. Not because they believe they are immortal, but because they are no longer ruled by the fear of ending in every small decision. When fear of death steps back, many other fears lose their grip as well. Fear of failure, fear of being judged, fear of not being good enough, because all those fears are tied to protecting a fragile self that is confined within time. When that self is no longer seen as the whole of who they are, living becomes lighter, not irresponsible, but less suffocated by anxiety. What is especially striking is that many people after near-death experience do not become fanatical or cling tightly to any religious belief. Instead, they often become more humble before the big question. They do not claim they know what happens after death. They only know one specific thing, that their awareness did not shut off when the body began to stop functioning, and that knowing, direct and personal, is what dissolves fear of death, not because they have the final answer, but because they are no longer haunted by the worst assumption. If we look deeper, we see that fear of death does not come from death itself. It comes from identifying awareness with a fragile structure. When that structure is threatened, fear rises. But when the identification dissolves, fear has nowhere to attach. Near-death experience suggests that awareness can exist within a different structure, one less dependent on physical form. That does not prove any metaphysical theory, but it may be enough to shake a fear that has lived in the human mind for thousands of years. And maybe the most important point is not waiting until near death to learn this. Even in everyday life, if you can recognize that your awareness is not completely identical to the body, that you can observe sensations, thoughts, and emotions without being totally swept away, then you have touched the same truth, gently. In those moments, even briefly, fear of death softens, not because you are thinking about death, but because you are living inside a wider field of awareness than the survival self. Near-death experiencers do not say they lost fear of death because they saw where they are going. They say they no longer fear because they saw they do not vanish. And that difference matters. It is not based on imagery. It is based on direct experience of awareness. As you listen to these words, you may still feel your body clearly, but if you listen quietly enough, you may notice that the part that is listening has no clear shape. It has no age. It has no weight. And it does not depend completely on the heartbeat in order to exist in this moment. Maybe understanding that does not erase death, but it can make fear of death less dominant in life. And when that fear softens, what remains is not recklessness, but a deeper presence with each living moment. And that presence, quiet and real, is what near-death experiences bring back. Not as a message to believe, but as an experience to remember. That awareness, at least in that moment, showed them it is not as fragile as they once thought. What may be most unsettling if we look deeply enough into near-death experiences, is not the question of what happens after death, but a quieter question. If, in the moment the brain weakens, awareness becomes clearer, then it is possible that what we call normal in everyday life is not as complete as we assume. Maybe, at the very moment we think we are most awake, we're actually living inside a narrowed version of reality. Neuroscience has long suggested that the brain is not designed to show us the truth, but to help us survive. Every second, an enormous amount of information pours into the senses: light, sound, movement, scent, pressure, rhythm. If all of that data were delivered straight into awareness, we would be overwhelmed very quickly. So the brain does something very specific. It selects, it discards, it simplifies, it builds a usable version of reality. In that version, you see what you need to see to move safely. You hear what you need to hear to communicate. You feel what is enough to react. The rest, so much of the rest, is silently ignored. This is not philosophical speculation. It shows up clearly in perception experiments. The brain can miss very large objects right in front of you if they do not match the current goal. The brain can fill in gaps in vision without you noticing. The brain can create the feeling of a continuous timeline even when raw data arrives in fragments and with delay. In other words, your everyday life is a construction that is incredibly sophisticated and stable, but still a construction. In this state, awareness operates inside a narrow frame. It is tied to the body, it is tied to the story of the self, it is tied to past memory and future prediction. All of that creates the familiar feeling of I. But for that same reason, many other layers of experience remain hidden. Many people who have been near death say the clearest feeling was not that they saw something extra, but that they were no longer being covered. As the brain's ordinary functions weakened, the filter seemed to soften, and when the filter softened, awareness was no longer compressed inside survival constraints. They describe a strange kind of lucidity, not like the alertness you get from coffee, not like the focus of intense concentration, more like a state where everything becomes more direct, with less mediation, no constant sense of needing to react, no pressure to keep a consistent self intact. In that state, many people say they could feel presence without tying it to time. No feeling of the past chasing them, no feeling of the future pulling them forward, only a wide awareness, still, but very clear. If we place this alongside what science understands about the brain, a thought-provoking possibility appears that perhaps, when the brain is operating normally, awareness is pushed into an energy-saving mode. It works well for survival, but it does not reflect the full capacity of knowing. In this view, everyday life is like a light sleep. We still act, think, and feel, but we only touch a small portion of reality, the portion that helps us function in the physical world. And the near-death moment, when survival priorities temporarily collapse, when awareness is no longer bound to protecting the body, may shift into a different mode, a mode that is not focused on doing, but on knowing, not focused on reacting, but on being present. This does not mean near death brings supernatural knowledge. It only means the filter changes. And when the filter changes, what is allowed into awareness changes as well. One person who came close to death described it as feeling like being deep in a dream and suddenly realizing you were dreaming, not because the imagery changed, but because wakefulness surged. Everything became more vivid, but not chaotic. The opposite, it felt quiet. If that is true, then a question becomes unavoidable. What are we missing in everyday life? Not because reality is thin, but because the brain has decided we do not need to know everything. Maybe much of the depth of experience is removed because it does not help us find food, avoid danger, or maintain a social identity. But the fact that something is not useful for survival does not mean it does not exist. In the sleep-like state of everyday life, awareness is forced to chase time. It constantly compares, remembers, predicts. That machinery creates the sense of a continuous timeline. But when that machinery weakens, as in near-death experience, time loses its central role. And when time steps back, awareness does not vanish. It simply stops being stretched across before and after. What shocks many people after they return is not where they went, but what they realized about normal life. that their previous ordinary state was far more limited than they had known, that there is another kind of wakefulness, deeper and less fragmented, that they had never touched while healthy. Afterward, when they come back to life, the brain's filter comes back online. Time returns, the self returns, but the memory of that awake state remains, and that memory changes how they see life. They no longer treat daily worries as the whole of reality. They still participate, but they are not completely swallowed by it, because somewhere inside, they have learned there is another layer of knowing, not dependent on how the brain has to manage the world. Seen this way, near death is not a trip outside of life. It is a temporary loosening of the filter, a rare moment when awareness is not forced to serve survival, and that opens a gentle but deep reflection. Maybe even in this life, there are moments when we can touch that wakefulness, even briefly, in complete silence, when you do not need to be anyone, when you do not need to go anywhere, when awareness is not pulled by time. Those moments are often tiny, easy to overlook, but they offer a hint that life does not have only one mode, and awareness does not have only one way of being present. Maybe what near death does is not show us another world. Maybe it shows us that this world, right now, is already far wider than we usually notice, and that most of the time, we are living inside a simplified version, streamlined, trimmed down, designed to get us through the days. As you listen to these words, your brain is probably still filtering, still selecting, still ignoring. But the moment you notice that something in you is aware of the filtering, that moment, however gentle, already carries a touch of wakefulness. And maybe that is where we begin to understand why people who touch the edge of life no longer see life the same way. Not because they left reality, but because they saw that reality never had only one layer. Maybe, when all the questions finally settle, what remains is not the question of what comes after death, but a quiet recognition. That death, seen through the lens of awareness, may not be a door slamming shut, but a process of unfastening. Not unfastening as destruction, but as letting go of layers that were once necessary for living. In everyday life, we are used to thinking that losing something means it is gone, but in near-death experience, what many people describe moves in the opposite direction. They do not say their awareness turned off. They say the things that once held awareness in place began to fall away, layer by layer. The first layer most often mentioned is the body. Not that the body vanishes, but that awareness no longer has to cling to bodily signals. No pain, no hunger, no heaviness, no tension, no pressure to move muscles. One person described it as taking off armor that had been worn for far too long, not because the armor was bad, but because it was no longer needed in that moment. When the body is no longer the center, awareness is no longer pulled into a fixed point in space. The feeling of I am here is no longer tied to a specific location. And when space loses its grip, another layer begins to loosen. Time. In ordinary life, time almost never disappears from the background of awareness. Even when you're not thinking about it, the brain keeps arranging experience into before and after. Past memory is carried forward. Future prediction is prepared in advance. That constant organizing creates the feeling of a continuous life stretching out. But when brain networks responsible for maintaining that order weaken, time can no longer hold its familiar shape. Many people say they no longer feel like they are inside a current. Not because everything freezes, but because there is no reference point left to call before or after. In that state, there is no past to regret and no future to fear. Only a bare kind of presence, direct and unclothed. And what is striking is that the absence of time does not come with panic. It often comes with deep peace. This suggests that the tension humans carry may not come from existence itself, but from having to constantly anchor awareness to a timeline. When the anchor is released, awareness does not disappear. It simply stops being stretched. And when body and time have both loosened, another layer begins to come away. The survival ego. This ego is not your whole self. It is a psychological structure built to help you function in the physical world. It tracks threat. It compares. It defends. It keeps asking, who am I in relation to what is around me? In everyday life, this survival ego runs almost non-stop. Even when you are resting, it is quietly evaluating. It is what creates the sense of separation between me and not me. But in near-death experience, when there is no longer a job of protecting the body, this ego gradually loses its role. And when it steps back, something very strange happens. Awareness does not disappear with the ego. Many people say they feel wider. No clear boundary between the observer and what is observed. No need to assert identity. Only knowing, quiet, and full, without a specific name. This is the key idea in One Killer Point here. What is removed in near-death experience is not awareness. It is the layers of structure that awareness once needed for survival. When those structures fall away, what remains is not emptiness, but a kind of knowing that is no longer confined. Seen this way, death is not a switch being flipped off. It is a gradual removal of interfaces. The body interface, the time interface, the ego interface. What is worth reflecting on is that in everyday life, we mistake these interfaces for awareness itself. We assume that if the body stops, awareness must stop. If time ends, experience must vanish. If ego dissolves, there is no one left to know. But near-death experience, even if it is not absolute proof, offers another possibility. That awareness may be more independent than we assume, and what we call I may be a temporary configuration. This also helps explain why many people after near-death no longer fear death in the old way, not because they are certain a specific place is waiting for them, but because they directly experience layers loosening without awareness being destroyed. They know, not through belief, but through experience, that unfastening does not always mean loss. Sometimes it means becoming lighter, and maybe the most profound part of this recognition is not about death at all. It is about how we live. If awareness is not fully dependent on survival structures, then even in this life there are moments when we can loosen them. No need to wait for near death. No need to wait for the body to weaken. Only those very quiet moments when you do not need to be anyone, go anywhere, or prove anything. In those moments, even if brief, you may feel a touch of a less confined state. Maybe that is why deep meditation, moments of complete stillness, or experiences near the edge of consciousness can carry a similar quality, not because they are the same on the surface, but because they do the same thing. They weaken the interfaces, and when those layers loosen, what remains does not have to be created. It has always been there. If death is truly a process of unfastening, then the deepest human fear may not be the fear of not existing, but the fear of letting go of what is familiar. The familiar body, the familiar time, the familiar ego. But near-death experience suggests that when letting go happens naturally, without force, what remains is not emptiness. It is a presence that does not need to strain in order to exist. And as you listen to these words, with your breathing slowing, in the quiet space between two thoughts, you may be touching that very lightly. Not to understand it with the mind, but to recognize that awareness does not need to do anything in order to be itself. There, it is quiet. No ending. Only layers that were once necessary, now allowed to rest. And maybe that is the gentlest way to look at death, not as a wall, but as a final unfastening of what once helped us move through this life. And then, after everything that has been loosened, after the body, after time, after the survival ego, perhaps what remains is not a conclusion, but a very quiet question. A question not meant to be answered right away, not demanding explanation, not asking for proof. A question that only needs to be set down, as lightly as the last breath before falling into deep sleep. If it is true that in the moment the brain can no longer fully control, awareness becomes clearer than ever, then what does that really mean? In everyday life, the brain is always working. It measures, compares, categorizes, predicts. It builds a familiar world so we can live, work, love, and avoid danger. Because of it, we know where we are, who we are, and where we're headed. But that same process is like a thick pane of filtering glass. It stabilizes the picture, but it also blurs whatever is not necessary for survival. And not necessary does not mean not real. In near-death experience, when that filtering glass cracks, many people do not say they fall into chaos. They say everything becomes brighter, clearer, more direct. Not in the sense of more detail, but in the sense of less noise. That creates a paradox that is hard to sit with. If the brain is the source of awareness, then when the brain weakens, awareness should weaken too. But if, in the moments when the brain can no longer fully control, knowing becomes deeper, then what is the brain really doing? Maybe the brain is not the light, but the lampshade. When the shade is intact, the light is directed, focused, useful for life. But when the shade cracks, the light does not go out. It simply stops being forced into a familiar shape. If we look that way, many things in everyday life begin to feel different. When we are tense, anxious, defensive, maybe it is not because we are too awake. Maybe it is because we are trapped in a high control mode, a mode that is necessary for survival, but not the whole of reality. And when that mode softens, whether in deep meditation, in moments of quiet, or in experiences close to the edge, what appears is not loss of control, but a different kind of freedom. Freedom not to do more, but to not have to do anything at all. The question then is no longer what happens after death. It becomes a far more unsettling question. If awareness is clearest when the brain is not controlling, then for this entire life, while the brain is controlling non-stop, what state are we in? Are we truly awake, or are we simply functioning beautifully inside a finely programmed survival dream? A dream where we name everything, label every experience, build a story about ourselves, and believe that story is the whole truth. A dream so convincing we rarely question it, because it keeps us alive. And if that is the case, then near-death experience is not something strange at the end of life. It may be a rare moment when the dream is interrupted, when the familiar curtain lifts, not to show another world, but to show this reality more directly. Not reality filtered, not reality explained, but reality before it is lined up, before it is divided, before it is assigned roles. Maybe that is why many people after near death are not obsessed with proving what they experienced. They do not try to convince others. They simply live differently, lighter, less defensive, less attached to the story of self. Not because they know something with certainty, but because they have touched a state where knowing is not as important as being present. And if so, the final question does not point toward death. It turns back toward this life, quietly. If awareness can remain clear when control mechanisms temporarily let go, then right now, in ordinary moments, what is covering it? Is it the constant effort to become someone, to get somewhere, to keep everything inside a familiar order? And if one day, not near death, but in a very quiet moment, we allow those efforts to rest, what would remain? This question does not need an immediate answer. It is not a question to think about, but a question to be with. And maybe, as you listen, as breathing slows, in the space between two thoughts, you can already sense it a little, not with the mind, but with a gentle knowing that is close. And if so, maybe what matters is not trying to become more awake, but realizing we were never completely asleep. We simply became too used to our own dream. There, the question is set down, very lightly, and what remains needs no words. And here, as the story begins to settle, maybe the most important thing is not what you've just heard, but what is still lingering inside you right now. Maybe you can sense why so many people who have been close to death say it felt more real than everyday life. Not because they saw a strange new world, but because in that moment, the familiar filters temporarily fell away. When the brain no longer has the strength to organize, categorize, control, and defend, experience is no longer compressed to serve survival. It is allowed to appear more directly, more deeply, and more completely. You may also see the brain's role more clearly now. The brain is not necessarily the place where awareness is created. It may be the place where awareness is limited, like a regulator that keeps experience within a range that human life can manage. When that regulator is strong, the world feels stable, familiar, and orderly. When it weakens, what appears is not chaos, but another kind of clarity, less divided, less confined. From this perspective, death no longer looks like a dark abyss. It is not necessarily an ending. It may be a shift of state, a gradual unfastening from the body, unfastening from the sense of time, unfastening from the survival ego that is so tightly bound to physical life. Not to disappear, but to no longer be limited in the old way. This does not ask you to believe. It only invites you to look differently, more gently, more widely, with less fear. Maybe the greatest value of near-death stories is not that they answer the question of what comes after death, but that they turn a light back onto this life. They suggest that what we call everyday wakefulness may simply be the survival filter working extremely well, and that behind that filter, there has always been a deeper layer of knowing, quieter, steadier, never truly gone. If you're listening to these words late at night, when the light has softened, when the body is growing heavy, then you do not need to carry any answers into sleep. The questions can stay behind, dissolving with the slowing breath. Awareness does not need to understand more in order to rest. Maybe sleep itself is a gentle way for the brain to temporarily loosen its grip, a natural way for the inner world to quiet down, for experience to stop being pushed to perform. So if anything is still echoing softly in you right now, let it be there. No need to hold it. No need to explain it. Just allow it to drift with your breathing, slowly and safely. I wish you peaceful sleep. May tonight bring you rest, not only in your body, but also in your mind. And I will see you again on the next journey of Sleep by Knowledge,